It is 7:30 in the evening on Tuesday, July 17th, 1985. Moscow. A man is standing outside a bakery on Kutuzovsky Prospekt, one of the main boulevards of the Soviet capital. He is holding a red shopping bag. He is wearing ordinary clothes. He looks like a man waiting for someone, or for nothing in particular. The kind of person you pass on any street in any city without registering. He is one of the most valuable intelligence assets in the history of the Western Alliance. He has been passing the most sensitive secrets of the KGB, the Soviet secret police, the organization he works for, the organization his father worked for, to British intelligence for 11 years. He knows things about Soviet nuclear strategy, about KGB operations in Western countries, about the internal thinking of the Kremlin, that no other human source in the West has ever been able to provide. He has given the British, and through them the Americans, an understanding of what the Soviet leadership actually believes and actually fears that has shaped Western policy at the highest levels. And he is standing outside a bakery in Moscow because his cover is blown. He was recalled from London 2 months ago. He was drugged and interrogated by a KGB general for 5 hours. He has been under surveillance ever since. He knows that he is, in the specific language of the system he has betrayed, under sentence of death. A sentence not yet carried out, pending further investigation, but one that he has no reason to believe will be commuted. He is waiting for a signal. Every Tuesday at 7:30, an MI6 officer passes this bakery. If the officer sees a man with a red bag standing outside, it means the asset is requesting immediate extraction. The officer will confirm receipt of the signal by walking past carrying a Harrods bag from the famous London department store and eating a Mars bar. The man with the red bag watches the crowd, and then he sees, coming toward him through the gray of the Moscow evening, a man with a Harrods bag, eating a Mars bar. The two men do not speak. They do not slow down. Their eyes meet for perhaps a second. And then they walk off in separate directions. And the most audacious intelligence extraction operation of the Cold War begins. This is the story of Oleg Gordievsky, the KGB colonel who spent 11 years betraying every secret his organization possessed to the British, who survived being drugged and interrogated by the most sophisticated counterintelligence service in the world, who escaped the Soviet Union hidden in the trunk of a car with a baby's diaper placed over his face to mask his scent from the border dogs, and who provided Western governments with intelligence that, by the assessment of those who handled it, may have prevented a nuclear war. It is also a story about America, about Ronald Reagan, and about how a man inside the KGB changed the way the most powerful president in the world understood the adversary he was facing. The CIA did not know Gordievsky existed until he was almost caught. But the intelligence he provided, passed from MI6 to the CIA to the White House, shaped the decisions that ended the Cold War. And it is a story about betrayal, which is to say, it is a story about loyalty, about what a man owes to the system that made him, and what he owes to something larger than that system, and what happens when those two obligations become impossible to hold simultaneously. Oleg Antonovich Gordievsky was born on October 10, 1938, in Moscow, into a family that was, by Soviet standards, deeply embedded in the security apparatus of the state. His father was an officer of the NKVD, the predecessor to the KGB, Stalin's secret police. Growing up in a family like that meant growing up inside the system, understanding its rhythms and its logic and its rewards from the inside. It was not, in itself, a source of disillusionment. It was simply the world he knew. He was an exceptional student. He learned German, then Danish, then Swedish, then Norwegian, then English, languages that would make him valuable to an intelligence service that needed people who could operate in Western Europe without an accent that gave them away. He studied at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, the elite university that produced Soviet diplomats and intelligence officers, and he was recruited into the KGB's first chief directorate, the branch responsible for foreign intelligence operations, in 1962. His first foreign posting was to East Berlin in August of 1961. He arrived just before the Berlin Wall went up. He watched it being built, the concrete blocks, the barbed wire, the watchtowers, the transformation of a city into a divided prison. And something in the experience lodged itself in him in a way that he would spend years trying to understand. The wall was not an abstraction. It was a physical demonstration of what the Soviet system required to maintain itself. It could only survive by making it impossible for people to choose something else. He went back to Moscow. He was posted to Copenhagen, in Denmark, where he served 2 stints at the Soviet embassy, the first in the late 1960s, the second in the early 1970s. It was in Copenhagen that the disenchantment that had begun at the Berlin Wall was deepened by something that he could not unsee. In 1968, Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring. The reform movement led by Alexander Dubček that had briefly promised a socialism with a human face. Gordievsky watched the coverage from Denmark. He read the Western newspapers. He heard what the Soviet state said about what it was doing and compared it to what it was actually doing. The gap was too large to ignore. He had begun, by this point, to do something that required a specific kind of courage that is different from the physical courage of a soldier or a pilot, the courage to hold a thought that your entire environment tells you is wrong, and to follow it to its logical conclusion regardless of the cost. The thought was simple. The system I work for is not what it claims to be. The system I work for does things that cannot be justified, and I am, by my work, complicit in those things. In 1974, he was approached by MI6, or rather, and this distinction matters, he approached them. He had been looking for an opportunity to make contact with British intelligence. An MI6 officer working under diplomatic cover in Copenhagen had been looking for an opportunity to recruit him. They found each other in the way that these things happen when both sides are ready, cautiously, through intermediaries, in a small brasserie and then in a safe house. He would later describe his motivation in terms that were ideological rather than financial. He wanted to work for British intelligence because he believed that what Britain and the West stood for was closer to the truth about how human beings should live than what the Soviet Union stood for. The money, and there was money, was secondary. He signed nothing. There was no formal contract. There was an understanding, communicated through tradecraft and mutual caution, that he would pass information to MI6, and that MI6 would protect him, and that this relationship would continue for as long as it was survivable. He was given the code names Sunbeam, Nocton, and Tickle. He went back to work for the KGB, and he began, systematically and at enormous personal risk, to give the British everything he knew. What he knew was extraordinary. The KGB's first chief directorate was not simply a spy agency in the conventional sense. It was the primary instrument through which the Soviet leadership understood the outside world. The organization that told Brezhnev, and then Andropov, and then Chernenko, what America and Britain and Western Europe were thinking and doing and planning. The intelligence that Gordievsky provided gave MI6, and through MI6, the CIA and the White House, a window into the Kremlin's actual thinking that no satellite or signal intercept could replicate. He told them about Operation Ryan, the Soviet program to watch for signs of an American nuclear first strike that we have discussed in earlier episodes of this channel. He told them how genuinely frightened the Soviet leadership was of Reagan. Not strategically frightened, in the way that two chess players are wary of each other. Physically frightened, in the way that men who had lived through the German invasion of 1941 were frightened, viscerally, in their bodies, at a level that rational calculation did not fully control. The Americans tended to see their rhetoric about the Soviet threat as strategic positioning. The Soviets, Gordievsky told his handlers, believed every word of it. They were not bluffing. They were terrified. This intelligence reached Reagan. The president who had called the Soviet Union an evil empire, who had proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative that Moscow saw as a first strike enabler, who had authorized an unprecedented buildup of American military power, this man was told by a source inside the KGB that the Soviets were not posturing. They genuinely feared that the Americans were preparing to attack. And that fear, if it was not addressed, could produce exactly the kind of miscalculation that would start a war nobody wanted. Reagan's response to this intelligence was not what his critics might have predicted. He began, gradually, to modulate his rhetoric. He reached out to Gorbachev, whom Gordievsky had identified, long before Western analysts recognized it, as the likely next Soviet leader and a man who might be genuinely different from his predecessors. The relationship that developed between Reagan and Gorbachev, which ultimately produced the arms reduction agreements that began to end the Cold War, was built partly on a foundation of intelligence that came from a KGB colonel who had decided in a small brasserie in Copenhagen that he could not keep doing what his system asked him to do. In 1982, Gordievsky was posted to London under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy. This was the posting that made him, in operational terms, the most valuable intelligence asset the British had ever run. As head of the KGB station in London, first as deputy resident, then as resident designate, the acting chief of the entire KGB operation in Britain, he had access to everything. The names of KGB officers operating in Britain undercover, the identities of Soviet agents inside British institutions, the communications between the KGB London station and Moscow center, the assessments, the strategies, the fears, the capabilities. He passed all of it to MI6. Every meeting he had with his KGB colleagues, he reconstructed afterward for his handlers. Every classified cable he read, he summarized. Every operation he learned about, he reported. For 3 years, MI6 had a source at the top of the KGB's London operation, a source who was not a peripheral observer but the man in charge, reading the mail and chairing the meetings and signing the reports that Moscow sent London and London sent back. John le Carre, the novelist who spent his career writing about the world of British intelligence, read the account of Gordievsky's story published by journalist Ben McIntyre and said it was the best true spy story he had ever read. This is not a small statement from a man who spent decades inside that world. It is an acknowledgement that the real thing, when it finally came to light, exceeded anything that fiction had imagined. In early May of 1985, Aldrich Ames walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington. He was a CIA officer, a counterintelligence specialist, which meant his job was to catch Soviet spies inside American institutions. He was also, as would eventually become one of the most damaging revelations in the history of American intelligence, a man who had decided to sell what he knew to the Soviets. His first meeting with his Soviet handlers produced a list. The list included the name Oleg Gordievsky. Gordievsky did not know he had been betrayed. He learned something was wrong when a telegram arrived at the Soviet embassy in London on May 17, 1985, ordering him to return to Moscow immediately for consultations regarding his appointment as resident. The phrasing was bureaucratically routine. The timing was not. He had just been promoted. There was no operational reason for him to return to Moscow. The telegram had the specific quality of something that is designed to sound routine and does not quite succeed. He covered his face in cold sweat, he would later say. He understood immediately what the telegram probably meant. He also understood that refusing to obey it would confirm whatever suspicions Moscow had, and that attempting to defect openly from London would put his wife and daughters, who were in Moscow, in immediate danger. MI6 gave him the choice: defect now, under their protection, and never go back, or return to Moscow and see what happened, with the understanding that the extraction plan called Operation Pimlico would be activated if he sent the signal. He chose to go back. His reasoning was partly practical, his family was there, and partly something harder to articulate. A sense that the mission was not finished, that if he could survive whatever was coming, he might still be useful. He flew to Moscow on May 19, 1985. He did not know if he would ever leave again. They came for him within days. 2 KGB officers took him to a safe house on the outskirts of Moscow. There was cognac, a bottle of it, placed on the table, an invitation that was not really an invitation. A KGB general began to question him. The questioning went on for 5 hours. He had been trained for this. Every intelligence officer who operates as a double agent understands that the interrogation scenario is always possible, and prepares for it the way a surgeon prepares for the operation going wrong, not with the expectation that it will happen, but with the knowledge that the preparation may be the only thing that saves you when it does. He had constructed, in his mind, a version of himself that was consistent with the KGB's records and with what they might know, and he stayed inside that version through 5 hours of questions and cognac and a KGB general who was very good at what he did. At one point, he went to the bathroom and was sick. He could not tell afterward whether this was from the cognac or from the fear or from the effort of maintaining, under pharmacological pressure, he had been drugged, he believed, in the cognac. A consistent and plausible account of himself for 5 consecutive hours. He was returned to his apartment. He was not arrested. He was placed under surveillance, cameras in the apartment, he believed, and tails in the street, and told implicitly that he should not go anywhere. He understood what this meant. He had survived the interrogation. He had not been charged. But he was not free. He was in the specific limbo that the KGB sometimes used when it had suspicions, but not proof. A limbo designed to provoke the suspected person into doing something that would provide the proof. He was being watched, and he was being waited for. If he did nothing, the investigation might stall and eventually be dropped. Or it might not. He had no way to know which. He soaked the cover of a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets in water. The escape instructions, written in invisible ink, became visible. He read them. He memorized them. He burned them. On Tuesday, July 17th, he went to the bakery on Kutuzovsky Prospekt at 7:30 in the evening with his red shopping bag. The MI6 officer walked past with the Harrods bag and the Mars bar. The signal was sent and received. Operation Pimlico was activated. 4 days later, on the morning of July 19, 1985, Gordievsky put on worn clothes, ordinary, anonymous, the clothes of a man who is going for a jog, which is what he told the KGB surveillance that he was doing. He slipped out of his apartment building, staying close to the bushes to avoid the surveillance vehicle he knew was parked outside. He crossed to an adjacent street. He had been running surveillance detection routes, the tradecraft term is dry cleaning, for weeks, learning the patterns of his watchers, identifying the moments and routes where he could move without being seen. He moved through Moscow's streets with the practiced casualness of a man who has spent his career doing exactly this, except that this time the target being concealed was himself. Within an hour, he was at Moscow's Leningrad station. He bought a ticket using cash, not the internal travel documents that Soviet citizens normally required, and boarded a suburban electric train to Zelenogorsk. From there, a bus to Viborg, in the direction of the Finnish border. He did not know the precise location of the rendezvous point. He had a description: a bend in the road, a kilometer marker, a section of forest. When something that looked like the description appeared outside the bus window, he told the driver he felt sick and needed to get off. He walked back along the road. The mosquitoes in the forest were, by multiple accounts, ferocious. He waited for 3 hours, alone, in the trees, bleeding from insect bites, covered in dirt, disheveled enough that any border guard who saw him would have known something was wrong. He had no way to communicate with the British. He did not know if they were coming. He did not know if the KGB had picked up his trail. He had done everything the plan required him to do, and now he could only wait. The British exfiltration team had driven from Helsinki, 2 cars carrying British diplomatic staff on what was, officially, a camping holiday in Finland. They had been followed from the embassy by 3 KGB surveillance vehicles. The British drivers had spent hours executing the surveillance detection routes that MI6 had developed for exactly this situation, driving through traffic, making unnecessary turns, stopping and starting, doing everything possible to lose the tails without doing anything so obvious that it would alarm them. By the time they reached the Finnish border area, they had shed 2 of the 3 KGB cars. The third was still behind them. They crossed into Finland. The 3rd KGB car stopped at the border. On the Finnish side, they turned around, drove back south along the road, and found the spot in the forest where Gordievsky was supposed to be waiting. He was there. He was bleeding from insect bites. He was unshaven. He had been waiting for over 3 hours. He was, by the accounts of the British officers who found him, in a condition that was simultaneously desperate and completely composed, the composure of a man who has survived the worst of what was coming and has not yet allowed himself to believe that he is actually going to make it. They put him in the trunk of a Ford Sierra. A British diplomat's wife, who had brought her infant daughter on the trip as cover, placed a used diaper near Gordievsky's face. The smell, the team calculated, would confuse the border dogs if the car was searched at the Finnish crossing. He lay in the dark trunk of a British diplomatic vehicle, unable to move, breathing through a diaper, as the car approached the Soviet border checkpoint. The guards searched the car. They ran mirrors under it. They looked in the back seat. They checked the documents of the occupants. They did not open the trunk. The car crossed into Finland. When they opened the trunk on the Finnish side and he climbed out into the cold northern air, one of the British officers offered him a Scotch whiskey. He drank it. He was, by his own account, crying. Not from fear, for the fear had been spent somewhere in the 3 hours in the mosquito-filled forest. From something else. From the specific, overwhelming relief of a man who has spent 11 years living inside a lie, who has been interrogated and drugged and watched and waited for, who has crossed a border in the trunk of a car, and who is, finally, on the other side. The Soviet reaction was immediate and furious. Gordievsky was sentenced to death in absentia, a sentence that was never rescinded, even after the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. His wife and daughters, who had been in Moscow when he escaped, were subjected to interrogation and harassment by the KGB. The marriage did not survive the separation that followed. He would not see his daughters again for years. Aldrich Ames, the CIA officer who had betrayed him, continued to work for the CIA for another 9 years before he was finally caught in 1994. During those 9 years, he betrayed dozens of other Western assets inside the Soviet system. Many of them were arrested, tried, and executed. The damage he caused to American and Western intelligence operations was, by the assessment of those who later investigated it, the worst in the history of the CIA. He is serving a life sentence in federal prison. He has never expressed remorse that anyone in the public record has been able to verify. Gordievsky settled in Britain, in a series of safe houses, and eventually in a quiet residential area south of London. He was debriefed by MI6 for months. He briefed the CIA. He briefed Margaret Thatcher directly. He met Ronald Reagan at the White House in 1987, a meeting that Reagan had specifically requested after learning, belatedly, the full extent of what Gordievsky had provided. The president wanted to thank the man personally. It was, by the accounts of those present, a warm and somewhat emotional meeting between two men who had never spoken but who had, in their very different ways, been working toward the same end. He became, in his post-defection life, an authority on the Soviet system, a writer, a consultant, a public intellectual whose understanding of what the Kremlin thought and feared was uniquely grounded in having been inside the room. He wrote books, he gave lectures, he collaborated with historians. He was, in the assessment of those who studied Cold War intelligence, one of the most consequential human sources ever run by any Western intelligence agency. In 2007, he was hospitalized unconscious in Surrey. He believed he had been poisoned. Thallium, he suspected. He survived. He pointed out, afterward, that Litvinenko had been poisoned in London the previous year, and that the pattern of Russian intelligence operations against defectors had not changed simply because the Soviet Union no longer existed. The sentence pronounced against him in 1985 had never been lifted. Russia, he said, had a long memory and considerable patience. He died on March 4, 2025, at the age of 86. He died in bed, of natural causes, in Britain. He had outlived the Soviet Union by 33 years. He had outlived most of the people who had sentenced him to death, and all of the people who had tried to carry that sentence out. He was, by the end, a very old man who had done something remarkable and had paid a considerable price for it, and who had survived. What is the American interest in this story? Why should an audience in the United States care about a British intelligence operation involving a British asset who worked for a British service? The answer is that the intelligence Gordievsky provided did not stay in Britain. It went to Washington. It went to the White House. It went to a president who was trying to understand what the Soviet Union actually was, not the propaganda version on either side, but the reality. And the reality that Gordievsky provided was specific, verified, and at the highest levels of the Soviet system. These people are frightened. They are not acting from strength. They are acting from fear. And the way you deal with a frightened adversary is different from the way you deal with a confident one. Reagan's pivot from the evil empire rhetoric of his first term toward the serious arms reduction negotiations of his second was not a capitulation. It was a recalibration based on better information. The information came, in significant part, from a KGB colonel who was standing outside a bakery in Moscow with a red shopping bag, waiting for a man with a Harrods bag and a Mars bar. The Cold War ended without a nuclear exchange. There were many reasons for that. The economic exhaustion of the Soviet system, the reforms Gorbachev attempted and could not control, the pressure of American military buildup, the simple passage of time. But among those reasons, less visible than the others, was the 11-year contribution of one man who understood both sides well enough to help the two of them, finally, hear each other. His name was Oleg Gordievsky. He died in bed. And that, given everything the Soviet system tried to do to him, is the most remarkable thing about his story. Thank you for being here for this story. Gordievsky's life is one of the most extraordinary in the history of the Cold War. Not because of the drama of the escape, though the drama is real and extraordinary, but because of what it says about what one person can do when they decide that the truth matters more than the safety of staying quiet. Next week, we are going to stay inside the world of Soviet intelligence, but the story is different. In October of 1962, during the same Cuban Missile Crisis we covered in Episode 2, a Soviet officer named Vasily Arkhipov saved the world by saying no. In 1983, Stanislav Petrov saved the world by doing nothing. But there is a third story from those years that almost no one knows. The night that NATO's largest military exercise almost convinced the Soviet military that the real war had begun. It was called Able Archer 83. It lasted 11 days. And the reason it did not end in catastrophe is, in part, because of a man named Oleg Gordievsky, who told the British what the Soviets were thinking, and the British told the Americans to stop what they were doing before the Soviets did something that could none be undone. We will be there next week. Subscribe if this story meant something to you. These histories exist. They happened to real people, and they deserve to be told.